High tide, low tide. Low tide, high tide. That's the title of our talk. How do we move through the constant ebb and flow of life to ride the waves and stay afloat? Let's grab a life jacket. So our emotions are amazing resources for us to tune in. The body tells us information that we need to know about what's going on. And so emotions are one of the keys to that. So when we talk about high tide, low tide, it always brings to mind, back in the day, I used to sail on San Francisco Bay. For a minute, I was actually in the Women's Racing Association. I was primarily ballast. I just ran from one side of the boat to the other one. And pull down the sail and put up a sail. That was it. But when you're sailing on San Francisco Bay especially, you must be very aware of the tides. There are two tides, 2 high tides, 2 low tides every day. And the thing is, the high point doesn't stay high. It goes high, and then it begins to ebb again, right? So it's in motion. It's in constant motion. So just as the moon makes the tides, we're affected because we're water. Adults are at least 60% water. Maybe women are a little bit less, but the average is 60% water. So we are responding in waves as well. Wouldn't you say that's true? Don't we have waves of emotion? We sure do. And remember that there are tides within each emotional experience. There are high tides of joy and low tides, just, gentle joy. High tides of sorrow and grief, and then just the lower tide of just being with the absence. So we have the high and the low, the flood and the ebb in all of them. In a sailboat, you do not try to go against the tide. It can be done, but it's really a pain. And you really have to have a strong wind in order to do it. So the wise thing is to keep an eye on the tides and to know when they're flowing. Be aware so that you can flow with the tide, and so you can let the tide assist you to be where you need to be, whether it's emotional or sailing. Last week we had sort of a flood tide of joy for Reverend Julia as she did her graduation and had her installation here at Sierra Center. So we experienced this high of joy. And then we learned about the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and we all had that experience of that low tide of grief and disbelief and just going from that high to that extreme low. When it's a high of joy emotion, we don't want it to end. And when we have that low emotion of sorrow and grief, we are afraid it won't end. But they both pass. They both do pass. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh said, an emotion comes, stays for a while, and goes away just like a storm. If you're aware of that, you won't be afraid of your emotions. And although I agree that the intensity of the storm may pass, the remnants of the storm may leave lasting scars. The grief of those parents in Texas and those friends and family members in Buffalo will never pass. Although the intensity may lessen, and life and loving support around them may help them back into a new flow, they will never get over it. But they can get through it. They can get through it with the loving support of friends, of family, of church, of community, of having the resources available to hold them. Sometimes that's all you can do is hold someone and listen to whatever they're going through. And we know that there's lots of different stages of grief, and maybe they're angry right now, or maybe they're just in shock, and maybe they're just in sorrow, and whatever it is, just holding them where they are. In Dunblane, Scotland in 1996, the parents of the victims of the school shooting there, where 15 children were shot with pistols by this one deranged gentleman, they got together and had action. They lobbied their government, and within the next 2 years, they got legislation that prevents private gun ownership of most handguns in the United Kingdom. That's England, Wales, and Scotland. And they have not had any school shootings since. We've had 27 this year. They turned their grief into action. But that was one phase of it. That was the high tide for them. But that doesn't mean that after that was accomplished, they didn't go back into grief. Because the grief does come in waves. It's not a linear process. You don't just, have it and then get on with your life. You don't. It comes and it goes. It comes and it goes, just like those tides. After the pandemic of 1918, Emily Post, who was the arbiter of etiquette at the time, wrote a chapter on how to support the grieving. And it really was all about listening and helping, bringing food, doing chores, seeing what needed to be done, and allowing them the time to just be with their grief. A professor at Northwestern University has studied the impact of these shootings on children over their lifetimes. And if they don't get the love and support and help that they need initially, they are impacted for life. It impacts their schoolwork, it impacts their life work, it impacts their relationships, because they no longer feel safe in the world. And one of the things that we know is true, regardless of what the universe looks like right now, what we know is that the universe is conspiring for our good. And shifting to that consciousness, that the universe is indeed conspiring for my good, regardless of how it looks at this moment, can be helpful, but sometimes we can't quite get there. We need some help to get there. So we are told that, love casts out fear. That is what the spiritual teachers tell us. And it does. When I went to Guatemala in 1976 and I had that 7.5 earthquake, I was terrified to come back to San Francisco because it's earthquake country. So I came back and was like, but I stayed with friends for a while because I couldn't be alone. And then I decided, well, I had to do something. And so the two things I did, I put together like a go bag and water and all that kind of stuff and kept it in my trunk. I had that for years. And then I took up sailing because I figured if everything's going to be moving, I might as well figure out how to roll with it, right? So we have to each figure out our own way of dealing with this, but with the help of friends, with the help of love, with the help of other people who've been through this, who can tell us how they did it. And maybe something that they tell us, not everything, but something that they tell us will be helpful. Most of us remember the little restaurant around the corner, Summertime. And that was owned by Amy and Shamba Cook. And their home burned down in the Jones Fire. This beautiful round home that they had raised their family in burned down in the Jones Fire. And that was devastating. They lost everything. Well, now they live in the south of France. And they were just visiting their daughter in Paris. And the joy on their faces was palpable. So, low tide, high tide. When my sister died and I didn't know how the world could go on after losing such a young, vital person, I had a friend who sent me a little letter and said, life is a circle. And for the depth of the sorrow that you're in now, there will be a height of joy. Now, I didn't really believe it at the time, but I thought, well, that's sort of hopeful. It gives me hope. And she was right. I have experienced great joy and also more sorrow. But I know that both will pass. But I have to let them through me fully and completely in order for that to happen. So, I would like to give us a practice that will help us all, I hope, to go through this current iteration of sadness and sorrow that we may be feeling. This is a practice, a Buddhist Tibetan practice called Tonglen. And so it's a practice of giving and receiving. So it develops our ability to be present for suffering and offers us a way to cultivate mercy for ourselves and others. It trains us to use the energy of loving kindness to open our hearts to suffering and transform it into well-being. It invites us to invite suffering into our being and let it break open the armor of our heart, to release the tender spaciousness of warmth and compassion. So I just invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable, or keep a soft focus. And begin by breathing in whatever you're feeling. Just breathe in and become aware of whatever it is that you're feeling. Maybe it's, anger, maybe it's agitation, maybe it's fear, maybe it's resistance, maybe it's sorrow, whatever it is. Become aware of what it is and breathe it in, and as you accept it, and on your exhalation, breathe out well-being. Breathe in the awareness of the feeling. Breathe out well-being. Breathe in. Breathe out. Accepting what is with kindness. Breathing it out with well-being. And now I invite you to think of someone, a person or a pet or a place that you love. think of that person, that pet, that place that you love. Bring that loving feeling into your heart. And then on your in-breath, imagine that you are inhaling hot, heavy air. And then on your out-breath, you're exhaling cool, light air. The love in your heart is transforming that hot, heavy air on the inhalation to cool, light air on the exhalation. Breathing in heaviness, breathing out lightness. Breathing in heaviness, breathing out lightness. The heaviness is suffering, the lightness is well-being. Breathing in lightness, breathing in heaviness, breathing out lightness. Breathing in heaviness, breathing out lightness. Now imagine that you're breathing through all the pores of your body. On the in-breath, heavy, hot air enters every pore and is transformed by your loving heart. And on the out-breath, the cool light from every pore flows, every pore flowing with that cool light. In breath, heavy hot air. Out breath, cool light air. Breathing in that suffering, breathing out well-being, sending it out to the world. Sending it out to the world. The sheath of the heart breaks open and the smoke of suffering dissolves into the spaciousness of your heart. Through every pore in your body, exhale all of your goodness and healing to the world. We have that power to transform. Transform the suffering into well-being, to transform that heaviness into lightness. I invite us to use this practice to allow us to be sources of light and peace in the world, and to lift our own suffering and that of the world through our loving kindness.